2:27 in the morning. Pitch black, no moon. Out on Blackett Strait, a wooden boat is creeping along on a single engine trying to stay quiet. And then out of that darkness, a shape. More than 2,000 tons of steel closing the distance in seconds. There's no time to turn. No time to gun the engines. The bow slices through the wooden hull like it isn't even there, and the boat is torn in two. Fuel ignites. The sky over the strait turns orange. Men are thrown into the water, into burning gasoline, into splinters of their own boat raining down around them. Two of them will never come up again. One man, gripping a piece of wreckage, watches the flames spread across the sea and understands, in that instant, that surviving the night is no longer a certainty. It's a question. We'll come back to that moment, to exactly what happened in that water, and to a coconut shell that, years later, would sit on a president's desk. But to understand why any of it mattered, we need to back up just a little and talk about the strange little boats fighting this war out on the edges of the map. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Navy had a problem in the Pacific that steel alone couldn't solve. The Solomon Islands were a maze of narrow channels, coral reefs, and pitch-dark straits where big warships were vulnerable, and visibility was nothing. So the Navy leaned on something small, fast and expendable, the PT boat. PT stood for Patrol Torpedo, plywood-hulled speedboats, roughly 80 feet long, armed with torpedoes and machine guns, built for hit-and-run raids under cover of darkness. They were fast, capable of over 40 knots in a sprint. But strip away the romance and they were wooden boats built to go toe-to-toe with steel warships 10 times their size. That tension, speed, and daring against sheer mass and firepower was the entire gamble of PT boat warfare. On the night of August 1st into August 2nd, 1943, that gamble was about to go about as wrong as it possibly could. The boat was PT-109, part of a group of 15 PT boats sent out that night to intercept Japanese destroyers running troops and supplies down through the strait, a supply route the Americans had nicknamed the Tokyo Express. It was a moonless, murky night, the kind where you could barely see the bow of your own boat. To stay quiet and avoid throwing a visible wake, PT-109 was running on just one of its 3 engines, creeping along at a fraction of its top speed, a sensible call for stealth. But it meant that when a dark shape suddenly materialized dead ahead, there was no time and no speed left to dodge it. The shape was the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, returning up the strait after its own supply run. In the confusion and dark, with vessels of every size maneuvering nearly blind, the Amagiri's bow struck PT-109 amidships and carried straight on through. It tore the boat apart in seconds. Of the 13 men aboard, 2 were killed in the collision, Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold W. Marney, gone before anyone could even process what had happened. The other 11 found themselves scattered in burning water, some flung clear, some clinging to the largest surviving chunk of the hull, which, remarkably, was still floating. One of them was the boat's young skipper, a lieutenant junior grade who, despite re-aggravating an old back injury in the impact, started swimming through the burning fuel, pulling in the men he could reach, checking names, counting heads. 11 men left alive, adrift in a war zone in the dark with no idea if anyone even knew they'd been hit. And that was only the beginning of their problem, because nobody was coming to look for them. Other PT boats on patrol had seen the explosion from a distance, but in the chaos, most assumed it was a Japanese ship going down, not one of their own. PT-109 didn't report in. Command eventually had to accept the grimmest possibility, and almost unbelievably, a memorial service was held for the crew of PT-109, while its survivors were still very much alive, clinging to wreckage in Blackett Strait, unaware that they had already been given up for dead. They clung to the wreckage through the night and into the next day, until it was clear the hull was finally going to sink beneath them. Roughly 4 miles away was a speck of land called Plum Pudding Island, known locally as Casilo, and if they were going to survive, they had to reach it under their own power, with no boat, no rescue, and one of their own too badly hurt to swim. Patrick McMahon, the engineer, had been caught in the fuel fire, his face and hands badly burned. He could barely move through the water on his own, so the young lieutenant, his back screaming with every stroke, clenched the strap of McMahon's life jacket between his teeth and started swimming, towing him the entire way, roughly 3.5 miles of open water breaststroke, alone with the sound of his own breathing and a man's life gripped in his jaw. It took him about 4 hours. When his feet finally found the coral bottom, he was so spent he collapsed right there in the shallows. They had made it to land. But land, it turned out, was not the same thing as safe. Plum Pudding Island was barely large enough to hide a handful of exhausted, injured men, let alone feed them. There was no food or fresh water, and it sat close enough to a Japanese-held shipping lane that staying meant risking discovery. So the group later swam again to a slightly larger island, Alasana, hoping for better cover and anything to eat. And it was there that the real problem crystallized into one maddening question. How do you call for help with no radio, no flare, no signal light, and the enemy controlling the surrounding waters? The lieutenant and one of his crewmen, Ensign George Ross, swam on to yet another island, Nauru, hoping to spot passing Allied ships or find any scrap of usable supplies. What they found instead, or rather, who found them, would change everything. 2 men in a dugout canoe spotted the castaways during their search of the islands. Their names were Biuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana, young Solomon Islander scouts working with the Australian Coastwatcher Network, a quiet, extraordinarily brave intelligence operation of local islanders who tracked Japanese movements and helped downed airmen and stranded sailors, often at enormous personal risk. Had the Japanese caught Gasa and Kumana helping American sailors, consequences for them would have been severe. They didn't hesitate. Once they understood what the Americans needed, these 2 young scouts became the entire rescue chain, balanced on a single canoe. Here was the problem: no paper, no pencil, nothing waterproof, nothing that would survive a canoe trip across open, enemy-watched water. What do you write a message on, out on a tropical island with nothing in your kit? The answer was growing all around him. At Gasa's suggestion, Kennedy took a green coconut and with a knife carved a message directly into the husk, short, urgent, and precise. Noro Issel Commander, native knows posset, he can pilot 11 alive, need small boat Kennedy. That coconut shell was now one of the only lines of communication these 11 stranded men had to the outside world, and it was about to be entrusted to 2 men paddling an open canoe some 35 miles through waters patrolled by the Japanese, with no way of knowing whether the message would ever arrive. Gasa and Kumana made that journey. Paddling for hours, staying alert to enemy patrols, they delivered the message to Allied forces. Word came back fast. The crew of PT-109, given up for dead, memorialized back at base, were alive. From there, everything moved quickly. A rescue mission was organized, led by Lieutenant William F. Libano aboard PT-157, with help from the local scouts who knew the reefs and exactly where to find the survivors. Kennedy was first taken by islanders to the post of Australian Coastwatcher Sub-Lieutenant Reg Evans, then went out to rendezvous with the rescue boat and help guide it safely back to his men. On the night of August 7th into August 8th, 1943, roughly a week after the collision that should have killed them all, every one of the 11 survivors was pulled aboard and brought home. 11 men who had spent nearly a week swimming between islands, drinking coconut water, hiding from enemy patrols, and pinning their entire survival on messages carried by canoe, were finally, unbelievably safe. For his actions that week, the hours-long tow through dangerous water, the repeated swims searching for rescue despite an injured back, that young lieutenant was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the Navy's highest decoration for non-combat heroism, along with the Purple Heart for his injuries. And his name, the one he'd scratched into that coconut husk in a moment of total desperation, was John F. Kennedy, a man who would, nearly 2 decades later, become President of the United States. That's really the only place the presidency belongs in this story at all, because in August of 1943, none of that had happened yet. He was just a 26-year-old lieutenant who wouldn't let go of a badly burned crewman 3.5 miles from land. The story didn't end with the rescue. In 1944, journalist John Hersey wrote it up for National magazine, and the tale of PT-109 became one of the most widely read stories of heroism to come out of the entire war. Patrick McMahon recovered from his burns. George Ross went on with his service. And Kennedy kept that coconut shell, the actual message that helped save 11 lives for the rest of his life, encased and preserved, a strange and humble little souvenir of the worst week of his life. Today, that same coconut shell is preserved and on display at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. The actual object, still legible, still telling the same story it told in 1943. And Buku Gasa and Ironi Kumana, the two young scouts who paddled tens of miles through dangerous water carrying a coconut and 11 strangers' hope of rescue, were, for a long time, treated as little more than a footnote in a story that genuinely could not have ended happily without them. That's finally changed. Decades later, their role received public recognition, including at the JFK Library itself, a belated but well-earned acknowledgement that the chain of survival that night ran through their courage every bit as much as anyone's. It's a story about a lot of things, about wooden boats and steel destroyers, about a war fought in dark, crowded straits on the far side of the world, about a man who wouldn't let go of a wounded friend in the water. But maybe more than anything, it's a story about how survival sometimes comes down to the smallest and strangest of tools, a coconut, a knife, a canoe, and two men brave enough to paddle it. If you'd like more true stories like this one, the ones history almost let slip through the cracks, stick around and subscribe, because there are a lot more of them out there waiting to be told.